today. My name is Jill Swing, and I'm the president and founder of SC Compassionate Care Alliance. SC Compassionate Care Alliance is a patient education and advocacy organization made up of patients, parents with chronically ill children, and other advocates who support the use of medical cannabis in South Carolina. And today, we are very honored and appreciative to have with us the bill sponsor, primary sponsor of the Compassionate Care Act, Senator Tom Davis. Senator Davis has been a longtime advocate of this bill from the very beginning, and I appreciate Senator Davis, you taking, I'm assuming your lunch break maybe, to join us to talk about a little bit about the bill before we go into session next week. So would you mind, just for those of us who aren't familiar, introduce yourself, and then we'll talk a little bit about how you got involved in this piece of legislation.
Sure. Thanks. I appreciate the opportunity to talk about S-150, which is the 2021 sessions version of the medical cannabis bill that we've been trying for several years to get passed in South Carolina. I have been in the Senate since 2009. I represent District 46, which is portions of Beaufort and Jasper County, including Hilton Head, Bluffton, Sun City, Hilton Head, and a portion of the city of Beaufort. And I first got involved in this, and others have heard me share this story back in 2014 when a constituent, told me about a granddaughter who suffered from intractable epilepsy, and how the medications and pharmaceutical drugs that were being prescribed really didn't provide any relief in regard to the seizures, and essentially rendered the young girl really not functioning whatsoever. And so and she told me that CBD oil, which is a derivative, or CBD, which is a derivative or chemical components of cannabis, could provide relief. She directed me to Colorado in particular. And so I did some research on that, found out that was correct. And in 2014, we got a law passed that allowed doctors to authorize their patients with epilepsy to take cannabis oil and to mitigate the epileptic. And Governor Haley signed into law. But in the course of researching that 2014 law for cannabis oil and epilepsy, I learned about all the other medical uses for which cannabis is efficacious, particularly autoimmune diseases, neurological disorders, chronic pain, and also discovered that there is a substantial body of medical research, peer-reviewed studies, that conclusively shows cannabis can be of benefit in ways that traditional pharmaceuticals cannot. So what I set about doing in 2015, and this will be the 7th year that I've tried, is to come up with a very conservative, very tightly regulated medical cannabis bill that would empower doctors, put an option in their hands, so that if, in their personal opinion, after doing an inpatient diagnosis of an individual, if that doctor thought that cannabis could be of medicinal benefit, then such could be authorized. And I really looked at the 36 states that have now legalized cannabis for medical purposes to look for best practices, to come up with a program that wasn't a slippery slope to recreational use, that provided a very safe product in the hand of doctors, supervised by doctors, a tightly regulated process of growing, processing, and dispensing the cannabis, very strict labeling requirements, very strict 24/7 seed to sale tracking surveillance, so that law enforcement could make sure that you didn't have the product diverted. My objective was, as I explained to my colleague back in 2015, to come up with a very strong medical cannabis bill that put medicine in the hands of doctors, but did not lead down the road or a slippery slope to recreational use. And I feel like, Jill, that we're on the cusp of getting that done. We've got a bill now that's already gone through 6 years, legislative cycles or sessions, and multiple subcommittee hearings, medical experts, law enforcement experts, experts from other states. And we have constantly revised and refined this bill to the point where I think it's a very mature product. And quite frankly, last February, full Medical Affairs Committee in the Senate was getting ready to vote on this bill and to pass it. We had the votes to pass it and to put it on the Senate calendar, and then I could begin the process of having it debated in the full Senate. But then, unfortunately, COVID-19 threw a monkey wrench into everything. And we weren't able to do anything in the year 2020 after that that wasn't COVID related. So, but the good news is, because the bill has now gone through 6 legislative years and undergone numerous subcommittee hearings, and because all the stakeholders have had a chance to be heard and to have their concerns or thoughts reflected in this bill, we're in a position now to have this bill move very quickly through the Senate Medical Affairs Committee process. We'll have a subcommittee hearing, I think, sometime in January, sometime later this month. I expect it to pass easily out of subcommittee. It'll then be on the full Medical Affairs Committee calendar sometime in early February, and I am confident that we have the votes to pass it out of committee. And then it goes on the Senate calendar, and the task then is to get it up for debate before the Senate. And so thanks to advocacy groups like yours, Jill, and because of so many doctors and so many grassroots and parents and advocates, we've got a very good bill that I think can be a template for any state that wants to authorize the use of cannabis for medical purposes, but wants to do so in a way that's responsible and safe and that empowers doctors and is not a slippery slope to recreational use. And I think that's what we've come up with.
Right, I agree. I guess that's why they call it the legislative process. It clearly is a process, and in this case, it's been a long one. And I feel like we could talk all day about, the nuts and bolts of the bill and where it started versus where it is now. But could you just give our viewers an overview of what's in the bill, or are there any substantial changes from this session's bill versus last session's? Can you just kind of give us a couple of points about the bill itself?
Sure. Well, first of all, I want to thank law enforcement and for the Medical Association and for others engaging in this process and for voicing their concerns and making their suggestions. That is what the legislative process is all about. It's to hear from all sides, to try to anticipate things that you may not have initially anticipated, and to come up with a bill that doesn't result in any unintended consequences. So I think that the input that we've received from law enforcement and from the Medical Association has made this a much better bill. Now what we've done is we have had to make some concessions, or I wouldn't call them concessions, but amending the bill to listen to the concerns that have been expressed by the medical community and law enforcement. And so what we've done, unlike other states, is we have a very specific list of conditions, medical conditions, for which physicians can authorize cannabis use by patients. And those particular conditions that are listed in the bill, and I'll just go ahead and summarize them right now, since I know people are interested. Cancer, multiple sclerosis, neurological diseases, sickle cell anemia, glaucoma, PTSD, autism, Crohn's disease, ulcerative colitis, and nausea, persistent nausea from a terminal illness, and a chronic medical condition causing severe and persistent muscle spasms, or a chronic medical condition for which an opioid is or could be prescribed based on standard care. And the reason we're very specific in regard to the qualifying conditions is for each one of those conditions, there is peer-reviewed empirical medical evidence that cannabis can be efficacious and can provide relief. So unlike other states, which have a very wide open and really, low limits whatsoever, our bill is specifically targeted for those conditions for which there is empirical peer-reviewed medical science saying this can be a benefit. The other thing that makes this bill very conservative and a purely medical bill is that the conditions that I've just listed, that authorize the use of cannabis, or doctors to authorize use of cannabis, all have to be diagnosable by a physician in an in-person setting. So I feel like it's very tight from that standpoint. We're not going to see, like in other states, simply having pill mills or just, establishments that are created and there's really no criteria whatsoever, and people can just walk in and come out with a written authorization to get cannabis. That is not what this bill is about. It's not what South Carolinians want, and it's not what I told them that they would be getting out of this committee process. But having said that, I want to say this. South Carolinians are way ahead of politicians on this issue. I mean, poll after poll shows between 70 to 80% of South Carolinians believe that doctors ought to be authorized to let their patients use cannabis to treat certain medical conditions if, in that physician's opinion, cannabis can be of medical benefit. And really, this is fundamental. This is about respecting that physician-patient relationship. It's allowing doctors to do what's best for their patients. And quite frankly, it's about getting politicians out of the way and preventing doctors from doing the thing that they think is beneficial to their patients. So when you've got 70 to 80% of South Carolinians saying this is something we want to empower doctors to do, we as elected officials have an obligation to listen. And it's not just South Carolina that has this particular percentage of the population in support. You've now got 36 states. Most recently, Mississippi approved it by a 74% vote in a referendum just last November. One of the most conservative red states in the nation. 74% of Mississippians are saying we want doctors to have this ability. So at some point in time, it's the responsibility of elected officials to recognize what their constituents want. We're sent up there to Columbia to do their business. We're set up there to go ahead and enact solid public policy. There's no reason whatsoever that 2021 can't be the year that South Carolina joins the other 36 states that have already authorized medical use for cannabis.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, it's true. And you know, I was thinking as you were talking about this, there have been a lot of discussions, obviously, about the bill and the excitement around it. The new bill, we've gotten a lot of press, and there's been a lot of discussions on, you know, social media, Facebook, about, you know, our bill and the medical bill versus adult use. And, you know, so many people are seeing state after state now that are just going ahead and legalizing. And, you know, some people are saying, well, we're behind. You know, this is a bill that should have passed 6 years ago. And, you know, it's going to be fully legal federally. And I mean, how do you respond to that? Because I think South Carolina, you know, politically is a little unique. I mean, you maybe touched on it a tiny bit, but how do you respond to that when there seems to be this kind of growing sentiment?
Well, I think it's a little bit unique, Jill, and southern states in general are a little more unique in that, let's be very frank, there is a very strong evangelical Christian constituency in South Carolina and in most southern states that came of age thinking about marijuana or thinking about cannabis in certain ways, and going back to the 60s and into the 70s, and back when the Controlled Substances Act was passed, there was a cultural opinion formed about marijuana. And look, I was raised in that context. I mean, I was to, you know, stay away from marijuana. That marijuana led to bad things. That marijuana led to the use of harder drugs. That marijuana was something that would hold me back in terms of my professional and social development. And so, if you're raised that way and you've got those mores, it becomes difficult to think of cannabis in a different context. It becomes difficult to think of it in terms of being a medicine. And I respect it. And this is an education process. I mean, again, until 2014 and until I was told by a constituent about the medicinal properties of cannabis oil that could help somebody with epilepsy, I didn't think of marijuana in medical terms. I didn't think of it in that context. So you have to be respectful from where people are coming from. Okay, they have life experiences. They come from communities that have certain social mores. And you've got to go about the process of making your case. You got to go out there and talk about, you know, what the medical research shows. You got to talk about what the National Academy of Sciences has said. The most preeminent, prominent medical journal in the country has said that there is conclusive evidence that cannabis can be of medicinal benefit to patients. Okay, that's not, you know, some anecdotal story. That's just not something you hear, you know, from a friend at a bar or in some social gathering. This is hard, solid science based on evidence. And if you've got something for which medical research proves can be efficacious, why in the world aren't you going to elect doctors to let patients take that? You know, especially when one of the things we're talking about, Jill, is chronic pain. I mean, cannabis is an amazing and efficacious product to address chronic pain. It gets to the underlying causes of that pain. whereby opioids, which are prescribed by physicians now, simply address the symptoms of that pain. It doesn't get to the underlying cause. And so you look at those two things. Just take that one example, chronic pain. Cannabis gets to the underlying cause of the pain. It doesn't have the addictive or the other physically damaging properties of opioids. And yet here we are with an opioid crisis in South Carolina, where people are literally dying every day from opioid addictions or opioid overdoses. And we have a much more benign, much more effective medications that doctors can authorize. And for the life of me, I don't understand, in light of, in the face of that overwhelming medical evidence, why aren't we empowering doctors? Why aren't we saying to doctors, look, you're the one with a medical degree. You're the one sitting down with that patient. You're the one conducting the diagnosis. You're the one that's in the best position possible to prescribe or to authorize what's in that patient's best interest. This bill is all about empowering those physicians.
Right, and I agree. So a couple different thoughts. One is, I know you've done a lot of work in addressing the concerns with opposition. Where is the opposition still coming from at this point? And what else can we do, can you do to address their concerns? I mean, is there any, I feel like I know that you personally have been over backwards, you've sat down and listened, and but where do we go from here? Where's the opposition still coming from, and how do we address it?
Yeah, there are three principal forms of opposition that we have to overcome. One category or one class of legislators say, we don't want to pass a state law that's going to be in contravention of federal law. We recognize that there is a supremacy clause in the United States Constitution. The Controlled Substances Act makes cannabis a Schedule I drug. We then can't pass a state law to authorize its use for medical purposes. And to that group, I respond this way. First of all, I argue that the Controlled Substances Act, the federal law, was not intended to preempt the field. It wasn't intended to prevent states from enacting their own laws that they thought were beneficial for or right for their constituents. And that's evidenced by the fact that 36 states have passed medical cannabis laws.
True.
I also point out to that group of legislators that Congress, every year, when they pass the budget, when they pass their appropriations bill, they contain a proviso in that bill or that Appropriations Act that says to the Department of Justice, whatever funds we appropriate to the DOJ, you cannot use that money in connection with using the Controlled Substances Act to invalidate or to stop state medical cannabis laws. So you've got Congress every year in the budget acknowledging that states have these medical cannabis laws and telling the Department of Justice, you cannot enforce the CSA to stop those medical cannabis laws. You also have, or you've had in prior administrations, directives from the United States Attorney General, him or herself, to U.S. attorneys throughout the country saying, you are not to enforce the CSA against medical cannabis laws passed by states. So you've got multiple examples of how the federal government recognizes what states are doing, are deferential to what states are doing. And so that's the very first thing I point out to all those group of objectors. The second group of objectors would be from law enforcement or from the argument that somehow if we allow it for medical use, then it's going to eventually gradually be, the camel's nose in the tent, and we're going to have full recreational use. And what I do in regards to that group of objectors is I say, let's look at the 36 states that have legalized this for medical purposes. Let's look empirically at what the data suggests. And there is absolutely no evidence whatsoever that a medical authorization for the use of cannabis increases recreational use. And really intuitively think about that. I mean, who in the world, if they want to smoke cannabis recreationally, is going to go through the trouble of committing a crime to get a registration card from the health agency saying that you could get cannabis, commit fraud with a doctor in terms of lying about conditions, and subject themselves to imprisonment to buy a product that's going to be much more expensive than what they could get by simply walking down the street and buying a dime bag? I mean, it doesn't make any sense from an economic standpoint. So I point out to that class of objectors what the experience has been in other states, and there hasn't been an increase for recreational use as a result of legalizing it for medical purposes. And then I make that economic argument that it just doesn't make sense for somebody who wants to smoke it recreationally to jump through all those hoops, commit those crimes, and to pay more money than they would pay already if they wanted to buy it for recreational use. The last category of objections comes from the medical community. The South Carolina Medical Association says, our members are used to the FDA regulating what they prescribe. They're used to being able to say to their patient, okay, I want you to take, this particular drug 3 times a day, and then come back to me and let's talk about it. Cannabis doesn't work that way. It doesn't work so precisely. And the reason is that cannabis interacts with an individual's cannabinoidal system in different ways. And so a particular cannabis product, depending upon the ratio of THC to CBD, which are the 2 main chemical components, is going to react in an individual's body in different ways, depending upon that individual's cannabinoidal system. So by definition, it's going to take a little bit more trial and error to figure out what cannabis provides the relief that patient is seeking. And doctors are used to working in that context. They're used to working when they know what this drug is, they know what to prescribe, and there's really no subjectivity to it. So, one of the things we've done in this bill, and first of all, doctors don't have to authorize cannabis use. I mean, doctors, if they want to be empowered in that regard, they contact, DHEC. They have to take a course in terms of cannabis medication and how to authorize its use and for what conditions it can be efficacious. If you're a doctor that doesn't want to have this particular authorization, there's no requirement that you get it. But one of the things that we've done in this bill is we've created this feedback loop between once a doctor authorizes the use of cannabis by a patient for certain medical conditions, and then that patient takes that authorization and goes to a dispensary and begins the process of figuring out, okay, which strain of cannabis is effective for me, which ratio of THC. Some may have high THC content, some may have very low, some may have more CBD content. But what this bill contemplates is a pharmacist interacting with that dispensary to provide guidance. And also for that information in regard to the patient's reaction, there's a feedback loop back to the physician so that the physician has some feedback in regard to how is that patient responding to the cannabis that was authorized. So I recognize concerns expressed by doctors, and they want to maintain some control or a supervision of this process. And the bill's been drafted in that way. This bill is, in my opinion, thanks to your efforts and thanks to the efforts of everybody over the last 6-7 years, I think is the best medical cannabis bill in the country in terms of patient safety, in terms of empowering doctors, in terms of empowering law enforcement to make sure you're not going to have a diversion of the product for recreational use. It's licensing all the major components, the growers, the processors, the dispensers. It establishes independent labs that have to come in and test the product to make sure that it's safe, to make sure there are no adulterants, to make sure that it's labeled correctly. Because on the label, you need to go ahead and know what the ratio of CBD to THC is, because you need to figure out, trial and error many times, what works for you. I mean, what is efficacious? And so one last thing I'd like to say, Jill, in terms of making accommodations, and this was particularly in regard to law enforcement. And in some ways it hurt me to make it, but in respect to what their voice concerns were, they said, we don't want leaf to be burned, and to burn leaf to be mode of consumption. We're much more comfortable if it was an oil, if it was something that was a salve or a tincture or could be taken topically. That way, the product would not be indistinguishable from those who consume marijuana recreationally. And we made that concession. We made that concession in good faith because law enforcement came to the table and said, this really gives us heartburn. Now, I realize that cuts out a mode of consumption that is effective for a lot of people. Mm-hmm. But look, I recognize that the legislative process involves trade-offs, and I want to be respectful of these stakeholder communities. So we've gone ahead and been responsible. And I can tell my colleagues, like I told them I was going to be able to tell them 6 years ago, that when they vote for this bill, They're voting for the most conservative, tightly regulated medical cannabis bill in the country, one that empowers doctors, one that provides relief to patients, and one that does not have a slippery slope toward recreational use. And that's what we're going to be voting on, hopefully as early as February.
Great. I mean, perfect answer. So I want to switch gears, and I know we're getting a little tight on time, and we've got some questions coming in. So federally, it seems that this is a very partisan issue, that in Congress, the Democrats typically look upon this more favorably, and the Republicans seem to be a little bit more reserved. And I have seen that that's a little bit different here in South Carolina. Obviously, you're a Republican. There's a Republican primary sponsor on the House bill, and we have certainly seen bipartisan support and really some bipartisan opposition as well. But I wanted to just quickly touch on this article that appeared in the Post and Courier on November 28th, a quote from you, and then I wanted you to just kind of address for a second how you're addressing this with the sort of the Republican holdouts, if you will. But the quote from the paper says, I think it's a winning issue for them, and I think it's a strategic mistake to cede the issue to Democrats. What you're talking about here is letting an individual, in consultation with their physician, decide for themselves what's best. I'm not sure what can be more fundamental to limited government than that. So, what are you doing to attempt to bring those Republican holdouts, I guess, to the table? And maybe this is a little bit redundant because you were talking about opposition in general, but is there anything in particular that you're doing to your discussing with your colleagues on a partisan type of theme in order to bring those guys around?
Yeah. The first thing I point out is that the Republican Party, at least historically, has been the party that wants to limit the role of government in people's lives, that wants to maximize freedom, that wants to maximize liberty, that doesn't want the federal government to preempt what a state thinks is in its citizens' best interest. So in each of those respects, if you're a Republican in the General Assembly, it is to some degree hypocritical to stand in the way of something that takes authority away from the federal government and gives it to the state to make it more compatible with what the people of South Carolina want, that stands in the way of what a doctor thinks is in a patient's best interest, and quite frankly, that constrains an individual's liberty in a way that isn't affecting somebody else's well-being. I mean, I often articulate my theory of what I think Republican philosophy ought to be is, my freedom to swing my arm ends where your nose begins. So that if my actions in some way impact or harm somebody else, that is a legitimate pretext for government to come in and constrain my behavior. But conversely, if what I do doesn't have any impact beyond myself and does not harm others, there is no legitimate pretext for government becoming involved in my affairs. And so I make that philosophical point to a lot of my Republican colleagues. The second thing I say is, again, I remind them of 70 to 75% of South Carolina, 70 to 80%, depending upon what poll you look at, want to authorize doctors to let patients use cannabis if in that doctor's opinion they have medical benefit. And that includes Republicans. The Republicans, to a degree of 70%, Democrats, 80%. I can't think of any other issue in government right now where you're going to find 70 to 80% of Republicans and Democrats both agreeing this is something that we ought to do. And so that's what I mean when I say individuals that are standing in the way of making this happen, Republicans, because they're afraid of a primary against them or they're afraid of not getting reelected. My point is, you're behind where people are on this. You're behind the right thing to do, and you're opening yourself up to the very thing you think you're protecting yourself from. So I make that very pragmatic argument to them. And then lastly, I point to the states that have legalized recreational use. Very conservative states, Mississippi, Oklahoma, North Dakota. I mean, these states are every bit as conservative as South Carolina is. And by overwhelming majorities, in some cases by the legislature, in the case of Mississippi, by a voter referendum, people are saying we want to empower doctors in this way. So, those are the three areas where I make the argument to my Republican colleagues. You think you're taking a safe vote here, or you think you're doing something that's going to protect yourself politically. And I just say to them, I think you're reaching the wrong conclusion.
Mm-hmm. Right. I agree wholeheartedly. And to point out, I think even Lindsey Graham went on record during his most recent campaign in support of medical cannabis. So I think more and more conservatives are coming around on this issue. So really quickly, Oh, sure, absolutely.
And this is a really good point that the chairman of Senate Medical Affairs, Danny Verdon, has made, is that if we don't sit down now, if conservatives don't sit down at the table now and pass this very conservative, very tightly regulated medical cannabis bill, if they just simply keep saying no, eventually there's going to come a time, maybe next year, maybe the year after that, when demographics are going to overwhelm on this issue and we're going to legalize it, and they're going to find out they're not going to have a place at the table. They're going to find out that they've lost the ability to control this thing. And so it's going to happen. The people want it to happen. The medical research says it should happen. I say to some conservatives, or any conservative, you want to be at that table and you want to be a part of coming up with what this bill looks like. And if you just simply step back and keep saying no, you're going to find yourself on the outside looking in while something is passed that you may have trouble supporting or may have trouble, in terms of your political future.
Mm-hmm. Great. So we do have one question from the website. Will this bill let cannabis users keep their guns?
Yeah, it can impact your Second Amendment rights. Even if the bill attempted to do that, I think that there are Second Amendment arguments that can be made that you can't circumscribe a Second Amendment right in that manner. So yes, that's correct.
Okay, great. And then my last question for you, obviously we're an advocacy organization, so I would imagine many of the people who are tuning in are either patients or supporters for various reasons. So from the grassroots perspective, what do you think we can be doing to help you? What do you think, what should we be doing now? What should we be doing once session starts to make sure that this thing moves and is successful this year?
Contact the legislature, whether it's a House member or whether it's a state senator, and share your personal experiences. Share the story that you may have experienced with medical cannabis, a friend, a loved one, because of all the arguments that you make. You can make those medical arguments. You can make the argument that there's no federal preemption, that states are free to do what they think is in their constituents' best interest. All those arguments are important, but they all pale in contrast to a constituent sitting down with their elected representative or senator and saying, this is what my life was like before medical cannabis, and this is what my life is like now. That's what made me a convert back in 2014, with that story told to me by a constituent about what her granddaughter was experiencing. And I saw for myself the relief that cannabis provided. Nothing is going to take the place of that one-on-one relationship between a constituent and a representative. So I would encourage you to write them a letter. Okay, not a form letter, not an email. Write them out an old-fashioned letter. And then when you have the time, drive to Columbia, set up a time to meet with them, and sit down there and make your case to them. And you might think that those things don't matter. You might think that anecdotal stories are irrelevant. I'm telling you that they're wrong. They're the most powerful thing that a legislator can hear. And a legislator faced with a constituent in their office talking about, this is what my life was like before, and this is what it's like now, that's the most powerful thing you can do.
Great. Well, I appreciate you spending a little time with us today. I know everyone is really excited about this bill and the prospects of seeing it finally move forward. We're grateful to you, obviously, for your dedication and commitment over the years. I know that this has been a long haul, and we just really look forward to working with you and seeing this whole thing through finally, we hope.
Yeah, I think 2021, Bill, I think this is going to be our year. We've put in the work. We've done the listening. We've gone ahead and drafted a good bill. We've educated the members. 2021, it's time to break some eggs and make an omelet.
That sounds good. All right. Well, you enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you so much for your time.
Thanks for having me, Joe. Take care.